The INC meeting happened in Ottawa. The fourth meeting for the UN Global Plastic Treaty occurred in Ottawa a number of weeks ago. And before that meeting, I had Oceana Canada's senior plastic campaigner, Anthony Merante, on the podcast to talk about what the goals are and sort of where we're at going into this meeting. Well, he's back. He's home from the meeting. He's kind of unwound a little bit, got his voice back, and he's here to talk to us today about some of the results that happened and sort of the inner workings of what this meeting looks like. So if you're looking to go behind the scenes at what these UN Global Plastic Treaty meetings are like, well, this is the podcast for you. We're going to talk about it on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. Now, today's episode, we got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking about the results of the UN Global Plastic Treaty's INC 4 meeting. It's the fourth of 5 meetings that have occurred just a couple of weeks ago in Ottawa, Canada, my home country, in our capital. And so we talked to Anthony about a number of things, sort of where we're coming into. He kind of gave a recap of his last episode where he's on in terms of, what the meeting sort of did, each meeting up to Ottawa, what Ottawa did, some of the things that happened while we were there, some of the lobbyist groups that have happened, and some of the interesting new research that have come out about the health and plastic, our health, human health and plastics, and how that's really shaping and could shape this UN Global Treaty, plastic treaty in the future. So it was really interesting to have this conversation. We talked a lot about what Canada can do, what other countries can do, some of the things that we would like to see in the treaty but may not get into the treaty. And it's just a great jam-packed information of the behind the scenes of what happened in Ottawa, Canada at the INC 4 UN Global Plastic Treaty meeting. So that's going to be the interview. So I hope you enjoy it. Before we get into the interview, I want to just let you know that if you want more information on things like the meetings that we see for the UN Global Plastic Treaty or just what's happening in the ocean, you can be made aware of all this every day. You don't have to wait for a podcast episode to come out. All you have to do is sign up to our newsletter. It's speakupforblue.com/newsletter. That's speakupforblue.com/newsletter to be updated Monday to Friday of what's happening in the ocean, what you can do to get a career in the ocean. So I have job advertisements on there, and then you'll get updated when we release each and every podcast on our network. So that includes How to Protect the Ocean, Beyond Jaws, and some other wonderful podcasts that we have going on with some colleagues of mine. So let's get into the episode with Anthony Merante, Senior Plastics Campaigner for Oceana Canada, talking about the UN Global Treaty, Plastic Treaty INC 4 meeting. Enjoy the interview, and I'll talk to you after. Hey, Anthony, welcome back to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about the results of the Inc. meeting for the UN Global Plastic Treaty?
Let's get into it.
Wonderful. Well, this was we set this up from the beginning. We had you on a couple of weeks ago, and we talked a number of things around plastic, but especially around the meeting that was happening in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago. It was the Inc. 4 part of the UN Global Plastic Treaty meeting. It was an important meeting. We set it up as what Canada is going to try to do, what the meeting is going to try and do, and then we were going to meet now after you had a little bit of a break and get your voice back and everything, so that we could discuss what happened at the meeting and kind of get an idea of what you went through as an NGO, representative for Oceana Canada, what that meant for you, what that meant for the meeting, what your sort of overall observations were, and then of course the results, and we can discuss them, which from what I've been reading wasn't what we were hoping for in terms of the overall gist of things and the way we wanted to go. But that's just the way sometimes these things go. So we're going to talk about what's needed for the fifth and final meeting. But before we get into all of that, Anthony, why don't you just remind the audience of who you are and what you do?
I'm Anthony Merante. I am a senior plastics campaigner for Oceana Canada. Based in Toronto, but often in Ottawa.
Traveling quite a bit, I assume, especially with the government being headquartered in our capital of Ottawa. Now, this meeting was, I assume it was about 10 days of meetings. Can you just kind of take us through, just take us through what you want to take us through in terms of the meeting?
And so last time we spoke, this was in advance of INC4 right. in Ottawa. And like other INCs, these intergovernmental negotiating committees, it is over 170 countries coming together to fight, negotiate, and work through what will ultimately become a global plastics treaty. Now, before INC4 opened, which is the fourth session hosted in Ottawa, we had a few expectations on how these negotiations would go based off the previous three meetings. Mm-hmm. In Budapest, we just had the resolution to build and develop a treaty. In Paris, you saw the procedure and how to build this treaty really come to take shape. And in those meetings, you did have a key division happen between countries, those that are ambitious and those that are non-ambitious. And those were the first little sightings of friction in the negotiations right. and how we'll move forward. And in Nairobi earlier this year, late last year, that is where we saw this friction really take the trade negotiations to a grinding halt. So much so that barely anything got worked through in Nairobi. And we set up a lot of expectations for Ottawa. Now, leaving Ottawa, as these concluded on April 30th, those big expectations, they were a little tempered, but there was progress that happened. We are moving forward, but maybe not quite at the pace that we would like to see.
Well, that's good news, because I've read a lot of things where people were frustrated with the process. There was a lot of talk of sort of other interests being there, and which we'll get into. But overall, sort of when you went into the meeting, what's your goal? From a perspective of an NGO, non-governmental organization, from Oceana Canada's perspective, what was your goal walking into the meeting?
So I think anyone from the environmental community, we take our notes and our goals from the host country itself. They generally put out their goals into how they want to advance the plastic treaty. And we build our goals and our ambition and our lobbying based on that. Canada came out quite strong in pre-INC negotiations and media interviews where there were quite strong goals. Number one, Canada wanted to build an inclusive negotiating process. They secondly wanted to streamline the text. They wanted to make it significantly smaller. When we went from Paris to Nairobi, the text grew larger, and Nairobi to Ottawa, that text grew even more. So Canada wants to get this closer more to a final text.
Right.
Thirdly, they wanted to make sure that we have what is called intersessional work move forward. That is dedicated time, work, and a lot of resource and capacity put between countries to tackle really substantive matters, often ones that require deep dives, expert opinion, and advising, maybe something that they can't quite accomplish in those 10 to 7 days while negotiating in one single forum. And from there, too, they also wanted to see the treaty move ahead in ways that are equitable for other countries. So these kind of means of implementation, financial mechanisms from it. Canada set up these quite standard goals from it. They may not seem lofty or ambitious, but given the absolute standstill that was found in Nairobi, these became really ambitious goals to move forward with. Yeah. So as an environmental group, our goal here is to take those host country goals and standards and really hold them to the fire and push them to move forward on it. As a host country, Canada can lead, they can be more vocal, they can do negotiations and backdoor dealing with other countries and negotiators to move forward on those key issues. And after the week, we did see that there was some progress in those, but that is basically how an environmental group sees it.
Okay. Interesting. So you're looking at building those goals. Now, one thing you mentioned in those goals was the text. And you mentioned shrinking the text because it kept getting bigger and bigger. Now, can you just clarify what that means? We talked about it a little bit last episode when we talked about it, but can you just kind of reiterate that and what it means by getting the text bigger and I guess the document longer?
Yeah, I think the best way anyone can think about this is that at the end of the day, you're going to have a treaty. The treaty is going to be just a written piece of legal drafting. As an example, you could have a sentence that will say, every participating country will phase out single-use products like beverage bottles by the year 2030, period. Now, that seems like a very standard sentence. That seems like something most people could get behind, at least to a degree. But now what you do have is over 170 countries trying to edit that sentence. And the biggest part about that is that a big block of countries, 10 to 12 countries in total, that absolutely do not want those strong, clear, precise instructions within the treaty. So what they will do is they will add what are called brackets, options into it. Picture you and you're doing a group project. And everyone's providing track changes and edits. It is the pre-final version where everyone's opinion's on there. Every country, bracket to their legal ability, end bracket, enter bracket, within their own nuanced ways, end bracket, will phase out products, bracket, or substances, comma, or blah, blah, blah. It just, the text keeps getting inflated. And the biggest stalling tactic here is that in the development of this treaty, we're working on consensus. We are not working on majority rules. So trying to get 170 plus opinions on how to word a specific sentence is an extremely hard task, and that is how they're working. So when I say that the text is inflated, it is every line within the treaty is subject to that scrutiny, that editing, that input, and we're still not at a place that has shrunk those sentences down to something concise and direct.
Now, who makes the decision? Like when you have all these countries adding their input, who makes the decision of whether that stays or does it come out? Is that the host country that's doing the meetings, or are there a number of different committees for each section?
So the way in which they tackle the treaty is that you'll basically have an opening plenary, a welcome to everyone, and then you'll have the chair of the Global Plastic Treaty negotiations, which are elected officials. They are people from different countries. They make up different representations from different continents, and those people are generally well-versed in the diplomatic process of negotiating. And they propose a way forward. And the best way they can possibly do that, because the treaty is so long, is they divide it into sections. These things they call contact groups. And the contact groups will generally focus on key areas of the treaty, and then they break off and negotiate within there. So it is not 170 countries sitting down and arguing every single line of every single section, but you do have these 3 breakaway groups where dedicated professionals from each country and each negotiating team participate in. And what we see is that substantive matters, those things about production caps, phasing out chemicals of concern, phasing out single-use plastics, becomes one contact group. The financial mechanisms and how they will implement the treaty in a way that is equitable between the global north and the global south, that becomes a contact group. And then generally the financial mechanisms, how money is going to flow between countries to enact this, becomes a group. And then sometimes you get these odd breakaway things where some topics become a little contentious or quite important. For instance, I don't know where this came from, but fishing gear appeared to be a really large part about this. A lot of fishing gear is made out of plastic. Nets are made out of plastic. Ghost gear is its own kind of floating issue within marine pollution. So that actually broke off of its own group. And then you have these dedicated teams negotiating those subject matters.
I'm curious about how the meeting works. I'm picturing more of a conference, right? You talked about a plenary talk at the beginning to welcome everybody. Then you have these different sessions, which I assume there's negotiations that happen in different parts, but there are probably a lot of presentations by different people who want to get their information out. And that goes to maybe it's presented in front of the negotiators. Is that how it works?
Similar. You're not too far off. And I think a conference is probably the best way to look at this, but I would look at it more as a working conference.
Okay.
You do have these large plenaries where all countries and negotiators come together to voice their opinions on the way in which they will proceed and the way in which they will work. In those large plenaries, they talk about what these focus groups will be and what the subject matter within each of those groups will be. They will negotiate the timing and the length and the scheduling of those contact groups to work through it. They will also talk about things of how late they will work. They will talk about things of if they should have extended hours, if they should have 2 of these meetings happening at once, if they should have 3 of these meetings happening at once. They basically gauge the room to see what is everyone's capacity, where can we move forward on different aspects of the treaty, and how can we do this in an efficient, clear way. That is what is generally going on in the plenary. The plenary is almost like housekeeping. It's very logistical. Now, once that plenary breaks, you go off into these concentrated working groups, these contact groups. And they happen 2 at a time, and they are staggered throughout. So something I can say is that negotiating is happening 24/7 at the INC. You have some delegations that have 20 plus negotiators on them. You have some delegations that are only 2 negotiators. So capacity and stretching of personnel happens in this, but negotiating is constantly happening behind the table, behind the scenes.
Are there certain countries that have, like, does it go basically by size of the country?
Not necessarily. Large countries with large populations but lower resources may have 1 to 2 negotiators. But then other countries that have low populations but a high economic interest in the Global Plastic Treaty have huge delegations. Gotcha. A really good example is Canada has about a medium size team. I think it's like a little less than 10, maybe around 10 people in total. Whereas you have delegations from Russia and Saudi Arabia that are over 20 people. China has a massive delegation behind them, and they're not necessarily all people within the government. Sometimes they're coming from chemical companies, sometimes they're coming from oil and gas, and they're being put on the federal delegations for these countries. So not only do you have the negotiations happening in these rooms, but you also have meetings on the side. You have expert panels coming together to advise different groups. And then you also have these host country events. For instance, there's this thing that we all kind of love. It's called the Swiss break. It happens usually near the end. It's a 2-hour funded by the government of Switzerland break that tries to encourage diplomacy between people. The tensions are high. They give speeches, they hand out wine, and they try to remember that we're all here for a job, and this is highly stressful. And sometimes you're negotiating from 6 a.m. straight up until 2 in the morning, which is a very realistic day for a lot of these negotiators. But they try to remember, like, we are human here, and we are here to negotiate in good faith with each other, recognizing that this is a global problem, and move together. So these country hosted events are sometimes really welcomed when stress levels get high, but that is
a little bit of a mental health break and a reminder of the purpose of why we're all here, right?
Yeah, but I would say you have about 6-7 days of 14 to 16 hour work days of negotiating, either in group with other countries or one-on-one direct meetings. You're basically preparing for those large plenaries where people will voice their opinion, and you want to have pre-knowledge going into that meeting that what you are going to say is going to be supported by 50, 60 plus other countries. So you're not going out on a limb here, but rather doing something that is efficient and moving forward.
That's really interesting, especially like these negotiators. You know, when we talk about negotiator, they're negotiating, with maybe they have agreements with a variety of countries, or they really want to emphasize specific aspects of the treaty. Can you sort of just give a description of, or maybe an example of what some of these negotiators are negotiating?
Yeah, so even before going into the room to negotiate, a lot of these countries have formed coalitions in multiple sectors. So you have coalitions that are arranged by the UN itself, small island developing states, otherwise called SIDS.
Yep.
They generally meet together and they have shared common goals. So when there are aspects of caps on primary plastic production, phasing out single-use plastics, data transparency, financial mechanisms, investments in recycling, they generally will go in unified and they will support each other. And that goes for the Latin American constituents of countries, that goes for the African Union, the European Union, Southeast Asia. There are groups of countries that are predetermined by the UN, and they generally get them to work in those ways because geographically you have vested interests. So you see commonality being formed there. But then there are unofficial groups that have been formed beforehand as well, such as like the High Ambition Coalition, of which Canada is a part of. These bring countries from around the world that want to see ambitious matters in the treaty brought forward. And they're all in constant communication with each other. So you will see coordination between these larger informal ones, like the High Ambition Coalition, with these formal ones, things called like the GRULAC, the Group of Latin American Countries, or SIDS, a small island developing states, or the European Union. So that way, when they go into these negotiations, they are unified and they are supportive within each other. And likewise, there are these, we'll say, like anti-ambition groups. They're called the like-minded countries, which is like Saudi Arabia, China, India, and Russia coming together to kind of form this blockade.
It's a little like a reality show in a way.
It is. It's a little bit like Survivor. There are alliances. If I speak up, are you going to back me up on this?
Right.
That is what it is. So then when they go in to negotiate, should there be a cap, a restriction on primary plastic production, which I will say proved to be the most contentious part of the treaty. And that could not get resolved in Ottawa, and that's a letdown for us.
Right.
But it proved to be too contentious because this idea of consensus, a treaty built on consensus requires everyone to be on board with that. And even within the high ambition countries, you have countries that they're oil and gas extraction based. Canada's a part of that. Norway is a part of that. They're high ambition countries, but they're a little weary to start talking about hard caps on primary plastic production. And that's disappointing as an environmental group, because we know that the best way of reining these things in, like emissions, is you have to put a cap on it. Otherwise, the industry is going to go out of control, and we know that it's an unsustainable industry. But aside from production, they're also talking about product design, phasing out polymers that are non-recyclable, things like polystyrene and polyvinyl chloride. Should those even exist in plastic packaging anymore?
Right.
What about plastic chemicals that we are now finding out week after week are causing cancers or hormonal disruption, things like bisphenols and BPA and PFAS and additives and coloring and dye, things that we're finding in our blood that are really putting our own risk at health. Those are concentrated subject matters that they're negotiating. And right now, they're not necessarily negotiating exactly which chemicals to ban. They are at the point right now where they're like, let's get consensus. If something is causing human health risks, we can remove it. We can remove this from plastic packaging in products that pose a high risk, like food packaging.
Yeah.
That's the level that they're at. And then when they go over to Korea in November, then they will discuss specifically, all right, give us a short list of six chemicals we need to ban out of this. That's how they'll move forward. But right now they're negotiating on those, like, how do we tackle plastic pollution? And when they go to Korea, it'll be the wording, the mechanism in which they will do it.
Okay. So there's some progress made in that respect in terms of...
There is. If we go back to those initial goals that Canada had, getting intersessional work, those like contentious matters that require subject matter expertise, advising from academic councils, etc., they did agree that products of concern, so those are single-use plastics that pose a threat to the environment, chemicals of concern, the chemicals that are posing risk to both human and environmental health found within plastic packaging, as well as product design. So just the things that are not recoverable, leaking into the environment, things that
Yeah.
we know, polystyrene, styrofoam, polyvinyl chloride packaging, we know that that stuff leaks in the environment. We know that it never gets recycled. We know that it ends up as litter quite often at all stages of its production. Those things they did agree on. We do need to
Hmm.
work on these. We'll have intersessional work, and they'll come into Korea with a pretty refined sense of what they will need to do in it, because they'll work on it over the summer. They've also tackled the hard question of how do we financially implement this treaty. They're going to have intersessional work on the financial mechanisms, or what they call the means of implementation. And they will discuss that and agree upon it and go into Korea with knowledge of this is how we will move forward with it. That's agreed upon by countries.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Now, we see we talk a lot about the negotiators. We talk a lot about some of these goals that have been moved forward. But there's also a role for people like people who are part of Oceana Canada, as well as on the other side, there are lobbyists from petrochemical companies and things like that. What are the roles? Let's just talk about the environmental side. Just a lot. Like, would you say that you were there to lobby? Was that the role or part of your role there?
Yeah, I would just like
Is
to
that fair
kind
to
of
say?
clarify for anyone listening. Lobbying is often a term that gets associated with kind of doing the bad stuff behind
Right.
closed doors, but
Right.
lobbying is anyone's fundamental right to ask your government to do something. You can lobby on behalf of something that is good. You can lobby on behalf of something that is bad. So it is accurate to say that is the role of Oceana, as well as other environmental groups, as well as fossil fuel and chemical industry personnel
Mm.
that are at the treaty negotiations. Our role is to make sure that our governments are sticking to those high ambition options within the treaty, that they are putting forward text and propositions that are ambitious, that will lead to upstream solutions, that will lead
Yeah.
to a reduction in plastic pollution and hopefully plastic production. That is really our goal. Our
Yeah.
goal is to make sure that resources are available to our governments, that make sure that they are on the cusp of what is the latest science, so that they're not kind of out there lost in capacity, that they are prepared for arguments or negotiations when they go to other countries, that something is feasible, that doing X will result in Y.
Mm.
Because what they are also seeing is lobbying from the other side. Taking stock of what happened in Ottawa, over 196 lobbyists from fossil fuel and
I
chemical
heard.
industries registered to this, and that is a 37% increase from the previous INC in Nairobi. And what is most shocking to me, and I don't think I was quite prepared for this, is that going into Ottawa, something new was on the table.
Mm.
There's a lot of knowledge about the impacts of plastic on human health, and it has really taken a center stage in media. It has really started taking a center stage with environmental groups. Doctors have started coming to the forefront, researchers and academics that have found these startling facts about
Yeah.
microplastics and plastic chemicals in our body and their possible effects on the human body. These things have started moving forward, and what really challenges the fossil fuel and chemical industry is the fact that they always would say that plastic is safe for you. And now the narrative and the findings are showing it's not.
Right.
It's actually quite risky.
Yeah.
So what I wasn't quite prepared for was this amount of advertising. There's always a little bit of plastic advertising at these things, at the airport, on buses. Plastic is great, plastic saves lives, whatever.
Yeah.
But oh my God, like trucks with screens going around showing this plastic saves lives and it's a respirator. This plastic delivers water and it's a water bottle. This plastic saves food and it's a cucumber wrapped in a single-use plastic versus one that's rotting and it's open. But what is concerning to me is even when you look at these ads, you hear doctors saying, yeah, but you are exposing people to harm when you're doing
Yeah.
this. Yes, no one is arguing that plastic has a necessary place in our world. And this is where I think that the chemical industry has lost the plot. No one is arguing that we need computers. No one is arguing that we do, yes, need masks and latex gloves and defibrillators and windmills. All these things have plastic in them. No one is arguing they don't. What they're losing the plot is that if I'm going to a hospital and medical equipment is being used on me, like an intravenous or a needle or a respirator or a mask that's being put onto me, I'm okay with it being plastic, but I would like to know that that plastic does not contain bisphenol A or something. That's going
Right.
right into my blood. I would prefer if it
Yeah.
was a safe plastic. If plastic is being put on my food, I would prefer that it is safe, known safe, and transparent about what is in it. And they're fighting that tooth and nail right now. And my guess is that a lot of the plastic products they use right now, they're going to be rendered maybe illegal because
Right. At
of
some
the different
point.
chemicals that are in them. And we
Yeah.
push the risk factor a little too high. We don't know. Science will tell us quite soon, but it's this ongoing narrative that they are really pushing against. And you're also seeing that oil and gas companies are well aware that the demand for diesel is going down. And plastic is an oil product. So if these companies do not want to make a transition to another material, another system, they don't want to be more efficient, it's very clear that they're trying to replace those net losses on oil and gas with plastic production. And there's a lot of studies that show like they're thinking about tripling, quadrupling production over the next few decades. And
Wow.
it's
That's
very
a scary
clear
thought.
that they're investing in a communications ad that plastic is essential.
Yeah.
And I mean, while it is essential in some instances, there are a lot where it isn't.
And it's interesting you mentioned, how they're saying we need it for health and stuff. I did see on a TikTok video while the meetings were going on, there was a user, a TikTok user, I believe it's Climate Charisma Girl, I think is her account name, but she was interviewing these people who were putting on some sort of demonstration, and what they did is they had these large banners, vertical banners that had, a plastic sort of respirator on top of someone's, like a patient, right? And saying these are, this is extremely important for this, like, and it's almost like they're offering sort of it's either we have it or you die sort of kind of scenario, right? And what was interesting is when this person interviewed the people who were demonstrating or putting on the protest, and she was just like, hey, this plastic could be poisonous. We're finding more and more that it could actually harm the body, and all these and they were agreeing with her, and they were like, yeah, no, we were just told we were paid to do this. It was a good job, and we're just here to kind of show what it is. But that those campaigns, I guess you can call them, or demonstrations, or whatever you'd like to call them, the screens on the trucks that go by, they're there to influence the negotiators, right? That's the sole purpose of doing it, is to manipulate the minds to be like, hey, this is essential. If you don't have this, we die. So don't kill people is essentially what they're kind of boiling it down to, right?
It is there's not one way to influence a negotiator or a delegate. It could be meetings, it could be social media posts, it could be marches and demonstrations, it could be advertisements on the side of a truck. You never know what will hit, what will resonate with negotiators they're walking through. But to the same effect that they're advertising, basically, if you don't have plastic, the world's going to fall apart, when in reality, it's just their bottom line is going to fall apart, that they're not being very financially conscious. I personally think it is extremely bad business to see 170 countries come together to talk about plastic treaty negotiations, and you see that over 140 of them are in favor of phasing out non-essential single-use plastics, for removing plastic chemicals that pose a human health risk, and for full transparency across the life cycle of plastics.
Mm.
And you as a company are not taking that as the world's best market research.
Yeah.
You are fighting the global majority of your
Yeah.
consumers at the government level, which is just it's business to me. I'm not in finance, but
Yeah. Well,
I
for
you
sure.
gotta say, if 140 countries, inclusive of the European Union,
Yeah.
are outwardly telling you you need to change your business plan because it is unsustainable for the planet, it's potentially harmful for people, and you have different options here. And we are showing you in the draft treaty where you should be downplaying your product line and
Hmm.
where you can actually make it a little better. Refill and reuse that does not contain
Yeah.
any harmful chemicals is something you should be investing in. There are
Yeah.
other materials and ways to deliver this. Single packaging one produce is dumb.
So
What
true.
happened to bulk? Like,
Right.
if you get bulk ketchup now, it's two small bottles taped together or
Yeah.
overwrapped. And you know what that means? That means I don't sell oil anymore. So here are two plastic bottles and a plastic wrap across. That makes up the difference of the oil and gas
Yeah.
demand that's going down. So I'm putting it over here. It's very
Yeah.
clear that the plasticization of our aisles, of everything becoming like individual pack or
Hmm.
smaller, and we're forced to consume more packaging for less product. It's them replacing oil and gas with a product of oil and
Yeah.
gas. It's not good market research.
No.
People are across the political spectrum fed up with litter, or they're fed up with pollution. And if you don't care about the environment, you're sure as hell going to care about your own health. Like,
Yeah.
it's going to take front of center stage to you, and it's to not pick up on this global trend is bad business.
Well, what's interesting too is it seems as though these, I mean, these companies, as you mentioned before, they're corporations that are funding these sort of these lobbyists and demonstrations and signs and advertising and things like that. And I find it really interesting where a lot of these companies or corporations, they're not really front facing. You know, like a lot of them are behind the scenes making the plastics. We probably, like, you could name them because you know them. But to be honest, before I talked to you, I never really would have thought of like Dow or anything like Dow Chemical or anything
Mhm.
like that that would be involved in this, or like Exxon or any of the oil companies. It'd be very difficult to say this plastic, this piece of plastic that's around my phone or that's around, like, that's in a water bottle or something,
Mhm.
is made by a certain corporation, unless you know that corporation. Like if it's a, say, a Coke, you know, a court subsidy or a subsidiary, or a Pepsi or something like that. But we never really, from a consumer perspective and sort of a citizen perspective, we never really tie that back to the company. Um, is it worth it in the long run for like places like Oceana Canada, organizations like Oceana Canada and as like WWF and other environmental agencies, to put out campaigns just being like, hey, these corporations are not taking your health or environment, you know, over your, like, they're taking greed over this. Like, is it too difficult to do that because of lawsuits and things like that, to sort of out them as corporation? And these are the products. So just as an example, Anthony, you know, you and I both live in Canada. Food, there's a big ban right now this month on, hey, let's boycott all Loblaws grocery stores, right? Because the food is high, they're making record profits, they're complaining. We can go into the issue another time, but they're basically saying it's supply chain that's increasing, but we know that's not. So a lot of people are like, we're boycotting any company that has to do with Loblaws, and there's a list, and people, if you want to boycott it, you can go. And people are realizing how big and how far reaching these corporations are. Is there any worth in, you know, sort of like Oceana Canada or other organizations to be able to say, hey, let's put a campaign together where we out these corporations for what they're doing?
So I think you're hitting on two really important points here. This who is consumer facing and who is not consumer
Mm,
facing. Now, at the treaty, you actually see a division of those companies.
hmm.
So you actually have the consumer-facing companies, which are they've kind of the same way the countries have banded together.
Yeah.
Businesses and industries also band together as coalitions specifically for the treaty. So you do have a coalition of businesses. It's called the Business Coalition, very
Yeah.
unique name. But it includes companies like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, ones that if you find their litter, their name is on it.
Right.
And because of that, because they're consumer facing, they actually have put forward recommendations for negotiators and delegations from countries to actually do something ambitious. They are looking
Okay.
for regulation on their industry. They're looking for phasing out non-recyclable polymers. They're looking for mandated requirements for refill and reuse because these companies exist in every country. I'll use Coca-Cola as the example. You have Coca-Cola in almost every single country in the world. Now, Coca-Cola in Europe, specifically in Germany, has to legally do refill and reuse. They have to do that. Across Europe, their packaging has to be made in a very specific way. In Japan, they have a little bit looser regulations with it. So I don't know if you saw, but they actually started testing etching in their logo to the bottle directly so they don't have a ribbon because the ribbon is non-recyclable.
Oh,
And in
interesting.
Canada, they don't do any of that.
No,
Because
which
in
would be great. I was
Canada,
about to say this would be nice to have.
imagine. But in Canada, you can't do that because labeling requires a black box around it. And
Ah,
in Japan, it doesn't. So they can etch. In Canada, you can't. In Canada, we don't have good collection and refill systems for non-alcoholic beverages yet. Let's get that in place. But for that instance, you have this global operation that has to act differently in every single country. And from a business perspective, it would be so much better for them if everyone had to do the same thing. So that's kind of what those companies are asking from in the treaty. And generally, they are
yeah.
mild to good, we'll say
Right.
that. Now, on the other hand, the non-public facing ones, the industry association, your Dow Chemicals, Exxon, Shell, BP, Formosa, those come together and those basically say like this treaty is bad, get rid of it. It's bad for business,
Yeah.
it's bad for the environment, it's bad for the economy. They'll kind of give any recommendation under it. So you do have that existing. You have influence from consumer facing and non-consumer facing, and they generally oppose from each other. But I think it's quite interesting that how consumer facing you are, they just pulled them apart, where
Right.
you would almost assume that they would be acting together.
Right.
But plastic pollution is such a nonpartisan, affecting all people problem that if you're consumer facing, you don't want to be associated with it. But if you're non-consumer facing, you don't care.
Yeah.
Like you don't.
Yeah.
You're an oil and gas company. You're giving a material into your effect. You don't know who makes the bag. I don't even know who makes the bottle for Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola
Right.
fills it,
Yeah.
but they
But who
don't
makes the
make the
bottle?
bottle. They purchase the bottle.
Right.
But who knows? I don't.
Yeah.
I should know, but I don't. Proprietary information. Now I will tell you a federal plastics registry, which is another bright spot of this the tree negotiations. The federal government of Canada released this federal registry of plastics that covers cradle to grave, and we will soon know who makes
Yeah.
the bottle, who makes the bag, of what material, where does it get sold, where does it go. That's a real bright
Yeah.
spot. So that's a little tangent, but
But
people,
that's really important for Canada too, because just as we identified here, we have to know who's making these things, right? Put a
we have
name,
yeah.
get some transparency around our plastics.
So we have these things going on that we have consumer facing, we have non-consumer facing, and we do have in Canada soon the tools to know who is producing what, who
Right.
is not the largest plastic producer, but
Mm-hmm.
what I think will be interesting is who is the largest garbage producer. Because we'll know
Yeah.
what goes to landfill, and a lot of people claim recyclability, but
But they're not.
recycling is different from recyclability.
Yeah.
So we'll find that out soon. But to your question of is it worth environmental groups like Oceana or other environmental groups doing these large expose campaigns, I think it's I don't really know if we are the best people to pose this. Now,
Right.
if the question is environment, who is the biggest polluter? I would say yes.
Yeah.
Groups like ours are really good with that. And I think the most effective thing and the industries that pivot the most and respond the most are those consumer facing. And I do think that organizations already do this and they do it quite well. Groups like Greenpeace do
Hmm.
these inventories where they will go on beaches into the ocean and they will name it. They will say Coca-Cola,
Yeah.
Nestle, Unilever, Dove, like they will give specific names.
Yeah.
They will rank them in order of their pollution. And they do that every year. And I think it's a really good communicated piece. But as we enter this new realm of it's no longer an outside problem, it's an inside problem too. It's in our blood, it's affecting our health. I think that is where I don't know if it's really effective to call out Dow or Exxon or Nova Chemical, but it is really important that I think our medical professionals
Hmm.
warn us because I'm not a human health expert,
Right.
but I do trust my doctor.
Of
I do
course.
trust things like the Endocrine Society. I do
Hmm.
trust nurses, and doctors, and surgeons, people that see these things happening. I trust academics that are working on this, that are researching. We have some of the best medical facilities and research centers in the world at
Yeah.
universities like UBC and McGill and McMaster and Queens. We have strong medical research here, and I think if we have strong cues from our medical professionals that let us know this, I think that's probably the best way that that campaign can unroll.
Yeah.
I could tell you
Interesting.
all day long this is bad for your health, but I'm not a human health expert.
No,
I
exactly.
wouldn't
You
take
need
that
the
advice
people who
from
are,
me.
yeah.
No, but I would like to see it coming from doctors. And what is really heartening is that the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, often called CAPE, so I'll give them a good plug here. They've started having these communications. They've
Yeah.
having doctors come out and tell you what they are genuinely concerned about when they are
Yep.
um, administering healthcare using plastics that they don't know what's in it. When they are finding plastics in the blood, when they are seeing people come in with inflammation, hormone drive cancers, with diseases, with childhood obesity, and they're like, why is this at such an
Yeah.
extremely high rate now? And they are finding their own research when they're treating patients, they're finding plastics are a lot of times like linked to these diseases. So I'm happy that they're available, that they are
Yeah.
speaking out on it. And I encourage other associations in the medical field to do their research and be kind of a guiding light to people because
Yeah.
we need to trust our experts.
100%. 100%. Now, when you're at a meeting like this and you're trying to get the attention of a lot of the negotiators, I assume, right? From an
Mhm.
Oceana Canada perspective. Do you often interact with lobbyists from sort of the so-called other side, like the Dow chemicals and the petro, the fossil fuel industry?
We do. And what I do appreciate from the government of Canada is that um, I'll give them a lot of credit in this department. They don't just listen to one voice.
Right.
They listen to both sides of the argument, which I think is the responsible thing to do.
Right. Yeah.
And often we will all be at those meetings together. Pre INC, during INC, there are stakeholder engagements, there are roundtables where environmental groups and industry groups will be sitting side by side making their argument. And I think that is a very effective way of doing stakeholder engagement because it doesn't allow either side to make lofty claims or
Right.
promises that have nothing backing them up. I've sat in so many meetings where I have heard industry associations say that they are doing so much for recycling, that they are improving plastics, and then that's it. That's where the statement ends.
Right.
And that allows opportunity for a group like an Oceana to say, how? Give me a number. You're
Yeah.
you're you're a business, you know
Yeah.
your
You track
supply
all this
chain.
stuff.
You track it.
Yeah.
You track it every quarter. You track what you sell, track your waste goes, or you just don't know. So if you can't say 100% of my material was collected and mechanically recycled into another food grade safe product, and you don't know that, you're going to have to assume that it did not. And that
Yeah.
it likely is part of the known stat that only 8% of plastic waste is recycled. That's it.
Yep.
So I do like that we aren't having these meetings in isolation. I like that these meetings are out in the open.
Yeah,
I like that we can keep each other in check. It keeps environmental groups in check as well.
for sure.
Because to the other side of the argument, I can't go there and say ban all plastic, it's bad.
Right.
There are real needs to it. Building, construction. If you want EVs to start rolling out, you do need plastics involved in it.
Yeah.
Medical equipment that isn't going directly into our blood, even the ones that do, it's allowed us to
Sometimes
do
we
a
still
lot
need
of
it.
great things. Like
Yeah.
people have higher survival rates of surgeries because of things like this.
Right. Right.
But it's by them being there and voicing that, it's true. Do I think that every piece of produce in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa, Halifax requires single packaging on it? No. Do I also recognize the fact that communities in Newfoundland, Labrador, Northern Nunavut, in Iqaluit, in any of the territories, any remote community in like Northern Alberta, there's a lack of fresh produce going to them,
Right.
and it generally has to be shipped to them in cold, closed containers and encased in a way that'll help them survive multiple days of travel and storage. And plastic will generally help extend that, but it's not necessary down the south.
Mhm.
But it is necessary for remote communities, and that's true. I won't argue against that.
Yep.
And that is where we find common ground a lot of times between industry and these stakeholder groups. But that's also how you help shape your delegation and your elected officials' views on plastic, necessary versus unnecessary. And that's kind of I think, an adult conversation working into it. And it is one that is good for the environment. It's good for human health. And yes, it'll take a dip for the economic interests of Dow Chemical, but the impact on the environment is everlasting, and we're seeing the effects every day.
Well, and I feel too, like the companies have the money to innovate. The companies have the money to make it better. Even though sometimes, a lot of the arguments are, well, look, we depend on plastic. It's like often we do. You've named some very good examples of what we need. And we do. Like I look around and there's a lot of plastic here, but I always say, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to? And I think though the companies who produce all this plastic also have the responsibility to innovate and to do better and to ensure that they have products that they change that can make it for the better. I think what happens is they get stuck in these ways and the money just comes in. It's like, if the money's coming in, why bother? And if the law doesn't require us to do it, why bother?
And I think that's a really good point, is the economics behind it, because plastic is cheaper, lighter, easier, not to pay people as much. Now, if you used glass or metal, refill and reuse, cleaning and washing, collecting, you're employing people there. There's a growing sector in that. It's maybe not as big of a profit margin, so that's why you don't want to do it. But it exists. It existed before all of this happened.
Yeah.
The milkman existed. Those companies existed. They just weren't as large and billionaire, had every level status within them. And I do think it is something that people need to remember, is that when you have a threat from a company like a Dow or a Nova or an Imperial Oil that this will cost jobs, what it really means is it will cost them their high profit jobs for the company. And what it would do is it would bring back jobs in washing, refill, collection, redistribution, refurbishment. Those are all sectors that have basically died out because of single-use culture. And those are well-paying jobs because they would have to do minimum wage for sure. But there's also the thing is those are safer working conditions. You're not exposed to a bunch of chemicals. You're not exposed to toxic gases like benzene. or polyvinyl chloride gas, which
Yeah.
is like, they're all known carcinogens. And hate to break it to you, but from a health perspective, and actually the Daily for the New York Times covered this medium well. People that work in those factories, they often have miscarriages. When they do give birth to people, if they're pregnant while they're working there, there's often a lot of birth defects into it. Cancer rates are quite high. Memory loss is
Yeah.
extremely high for people because it impacts their cognition.
Interesting.
But you don't get that in a
No.
refill in a cleaning station. They're really good jobs that just don't exist anymore because the profit is not huge on it, but it's not like
Yep.
they're going to be losing jobs. You just move them into a better sector. And it is
Yep.
that concept of just transition. It's that you don't close down a company entirely. You move it over
Move
slowly
people
so
over.
that people have jobs, people keep working,
Yep.
but you're working in a clean sector, you're working in a safe sector, and one that you can maybe be a little proud of in terms of an environmental impact. Because I don't know personally, but I have to think about it. If you're working in the oil sands in Alberta, that's the only industry up there. You have to work, you have
Yeah.
to put food on the table, you have to work, but that's got to be morally hard for people watching their neighbor's house burn down because of climate change in and
Yeah.
around the largest emissions of it. It's
Yep.
definitely changing the environment around them.
100%.
But that's all they have, because that company has not invested in something like solar or wind or something more renewable in that same province. They've locked in on one thing and they're not giving options to their workers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of great information in here. Just to kind of sum up, some of that we talked a little bit about the results of this meeting and going into the next meeting. Where's the next meeting going to take place? That's
So
at
the
the end of
next meeting
October,
is
right?
going to happen at the end of November in
November.
Busan, South Korea.
Okay.
Excited for it, but this is the final INC.
Right.
We are going into what will hopefully be the last one. Will it be the last one? We don't know. But you're going to go in there with countries having worked on products of concern, chemicals of concern, transparency, financial implementations. Those should be on the table. I still think the biggest point of contention will be production caps. And
Yeah.
I mean, as an environmentalist, I have to keep advocating for it. I have to keep
Of course.
advocating for what is called like peak plastic. We need to go on a downward trajectory of the plastic we make. We need to limit ourselves to what is essential and to cut out the non-essential. And just listen, you can only feel bad for a multi-billion-dollar gas company for so long. You had your time in the sun, and I think
Yeah.
green energy and green jobs are maybe a better way to go, and to take this market research of countries coming together to fight against this as maybe a cue.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's going to actually make it through.
Yeah, that'd be a
If they're going to try to push for a final treaty soon, you're going to need to do a little bit of compromise, especially if it's still not consensus basis, because those 10 countries, they're going to hold it up. But if you've got a huge bargaining chip, let's phase out single-use plastics. Let's phase out chemicals of concern. Let's unify product design. Let's make sure this is financially equitable for all countries to implement. Let's handle legacy plastic that's already in our environment, but let's make sure that we are also cutting things off at the source in these very key areas.
Right.
Maybe then they kind of give up a production cap. I'd be sad to see it go, but it's a big bargaining chip. If you are going to give that up, you better get 8, 9 very strong commitments out of that treaty. And I think that is on the table, and I hope our negotiators work in that sense. They know the value of that chip, and they don't just fold very quickly under it. But we'll see what happens in Korea. But we do have a little bit smaller version of a text. We did get intercessional work. We do have a legal committee that is now reviewing the treaty to see if it is enactable, which it is. But the lawyer needs to tell you that, not me. But you do have these things that are moving forward, which is really good. And one of the things I really liked about Ottawa was the government set out for it to be inclusive. They had a side event happening 24/7 right next to the building that delegates, industry, environmental groups, Indigenous leaders, frontline communities had access to influence the treaty negotiations, to hold panels on the effects of people, the environment, industry, data. It was awesome. It was called the Plastic Action Zone, and Canada was the first country to do something like that, to integrate, we'll say, like non-traditional voices in the treaty negotiation processes, because to be part of the process, you need to be UN certified, which is a 3-ring circus of the work you do internationally, what certifications you have, what's your operating budget, yada yada. It's quite a formal designation you can get with the UN, but a lot of community groups that are impacted by plastic pollution, they're not going to go through that circus.
No.
But because of what Ottawa set up, they were able to participate. They were able to influence. They were able to get their stories told and influence people that were maybe on the fence. Highlight these real concerns. So I hope that continues in Korea as well. But that's what we're going to look forward to. I think we're going to look forward to strong negotiations where we saw these bargaining chips being held close to people's chests. I think the cards are going to be on the table. It's a lot of poker references, sorry.
Right, it's okay.
I do think that every country is going to be pressured by their elected officials to say, get this thing done.
Yeah.
It's being viewed as ineffective, and if you cannot push something out, even if it's medium mild, it's something. Mm-hmm. I hope that it isn't something ambitious, but I think it is a very realistic thing that we could see single-use plastics phased out, chemicals of concern identified and banned from plastic food packaging, full data transparency across the life cycle of plastics, legacy cleanups of plastic that are in our environment and our oceans. And I think you'll maybe see a good shift of finances from the global north to the global south on plastic waste. Those are what I think the realistic outcomes will be of the treaty, and I hope that's at minimum what's in there.
Yeah, well, those are very good things that we'd love to see. We'd love to see that happen, and love to have you back on, talk more about plastics, Anthony, as we get closer to that meeting, or maybe even before that, if there's anything significant that happens within Canada or around the world that you would be able to shed your expertise on. So we really appreciate you coming on and giving us sort of a testament of all the work that you and your colleagues have done, at Oceana and other groups as well within Canada and outside Canada. So hope you were able to enjoy the meeting and your time off afterwards. But we really appreciate you coming on here and letting us know everything that happened. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Anthony, for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. What a jam-packed information episode about what happens behind the scenes at a UN meeting, such as the UN Global Plastic Treaty INC4 meeting. It's a really interesting process. You have negotiators, you have lobbyists, you have advertising going on, and different ways to influence the negotiators or potentially influence the negotiators and offer information sessions, inclusivities being incorporated in these meetings. It was in Ottawa, at least. This is an important aspect to learn about conservation. These international treaties, these international meetings that occur, have to occur certain ways. And it's good that you, the audience member, you, the listener, are able to understand what happens at these meetings. And even for me, it was definitely a learning moment for me to find out what happens at this meeting. To be honest, there's a little bit of envy that went on. I wish I was at those meetings. I wish I went to the one, especially in Ottawa. The next meeting is in South Korea. It's at the end of November, apparently, in 2024. And it's the last meeting, and it's going to really shape what this treaty is going to look like before it gets ratified by a number of different countries. Interesting things that came out of this podcast is looking at consensus and what that means and how that's going to shape this treaty. The fact that there were 196 lobbyists for the plastics industry, that includes, chemical industry, fossil fuel industry, and so forth. There's a division between companies that have their name and brand out there, such as Coke, such as Pepsi, a lot of different other companies that have their names on the bottles or on their product when they pick it up, as well as the division between other sort of just business coalitions that do not have their name out there, but they create a lot of the plastics. They the original plastics that are created, so from the raw materials. Really interested in terms of what they expect and what they would like to see out of the treaty. Very, very different. One's a little bit more transparent because they have to be, and others they don't have to be, so they're not less transparent. They're looking more for how it affects their bottom line. So a lot of things to learn out of this, especially how we have seen some progress, not as much as we want, but hoping that we get a decent treaty out of the last meeting in South Korea at the end of November of this year. So keep an eye out for any kind of updates. I'll have Anthony on once I hear if there's updates. He is really great. His people are really great at contacting me, and I would love to bring you those updates in the future. And until next time, thank you so much for listening. If you want to sign up for our newsletter, it's speakupforblue.com/newsletter. I'll also link to the plastics page on Oceana Canada for their plastics campaign. And of course, if you want to get a hold of me, you can just DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. Love to hear what you thought of this episode and what you'd like in future episodes, whatever you'd like to chat, anything ocean conservation related. I'm always willing to chat with you. If you're part of an organization, either small, medium, or large, and you'd like to talk more about it, you can DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. But other than that, that's it for this episode. We really appreciate you listening and sharing with people who you know and love, would love to know more about the ocean through this podcast. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.